You know, I still wake up in a cold sweat sometimes, thinking about what happened in those woods, what we did out there. It changed everything. And I just can't shake this feeling that we brought something back on ourselves that we never should have messed with. This all went down about 3 years ago, and I'm only telling the story now because the nightmares just won't quit. And maybe getting it out will help me sleep again. I wasn't much of a hunter back then. I'd been on maybe 4 or 5 trips total, all pretty tame. Deer, ducks, the usual stuff during regular hunting season. Nothing crazy, but I had these 3 buddies who were nuts about it. They'd been hunting since they were kids, knew all the tricks in the book, and were always pushing me to try for bigger challenges. That October, they called me up with this plan. Said they wanted to teach me how to hunt the real stuff, and that it was time I learned what serious hunting was all about. I figured they meant elk or maybe bears, something that would really test my skills. I said yes because I wanted to hang out with them, and honestly, I was getting bored with small game. The trip started before dawn on a Thursday morning. We loaded up the truck with enough provisions for a week in the wilderness. Rifles, ammo, camping gear, enough food to feed an army. The guys were acting weird from the get-go, making jokes I didn't get, and exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't paying attention. We drove north for 3 hours on regular roads. Then we peeled off onto logging roads that got progressively worse. Pavement turned to gravel, then dirt, then barely maintained tracks that had more potholes than road. My buddy driving kept having to engage the 4-wheel drive to get through sections where the rain had washed out half the path. After another 2 hours of bouncing around like ping-pong balls, we pulled up to a gate with a rusty sign that read, "Private Timber Company, no trespassing." Udi, one of the guys, hopped out with a wrench and popped it open. When I asked how he had access, he just grinned and said his cousin worked for the company. We drove through, and he locked it back up behind us. The road beyond the gate was even worse. Deep ruts from heavy logging equipment, fallen branches scattered everywhere, sections where we had to drive through creek beds because bridges had collapsed years ago. We passed abandoned logging camps, rusted out machinery left to rot in small clearings, and mile after mile of forest that looked like it hadn't seen human activity in decades. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road just ended. There was a small turnaround area next to a creek, and beyond that, nothing but wilderness. We'd been driving for 6 hours total, and we still had hiking ahead of us. We threw our packs on and started walking. The trail was barely visible, more of an animal path than anything humans had made. It wound uphill through old-growth forest, trees so massive you couldn't get your arms around them even if 3 people tried together. The canopy was so thick up above that even in the middle of the day, it felt like twilight down where we were walking. The guys kept checking their GPS and consulting a hand-drawn map one of them had brought. They'd clearly been here before, or at least had studied the area extensively. Every now and then, one of them would point out a landmark and nod like he recognized it. A distinctive rock formation, a dead tree with an unusual shape, a small meadow where deer had obviously been grazing recently. As we climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees got even bigger, older looking. Some of them had to be hundreds of years old, maybe older. The underbrush also got thicker, with ferns that came up to my waist and berry bushes so dense you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. We crossed 3 different streams on fallen logs. We scrambled over rock slides and pushed through sections of forest so thick we had to go single file. My backpack felt like it was getting heavier with every step, and I was starting to wonder if this was really worth it. The guys seemed to know exactly where they were going, never hesitating at trail intersections or stopping to get their bearings. After 3 hours of steady uphill hiking, we reached a small clearing surrounded by massive cedars. It was obviously a campsite that had been used before. There was a fire ring made of river stones, some logs laid out as benches, and a flattened area of ground where tents had previously been set up. As we were setting up our own camp, One of the guys started talking about the area. He said, "We were in a section of the forest that most people never saw, miles from any official trail or road. The timber company owned huge tracts of land out here, but they hadn't actually logged in this particular area for over 20 years. It was too remote, too difficult to get equipment in and timber out. That's when they finally told me what we were actually doing there." As we sat around the fire that first night eating dinner out of cans and passing around a bottle of whiskey, the guy who'd organized the trip started telling stories. He said this area had a reputation among local hunters and loggers. Not the kind of reputation that's talked about openly, but the kind that's whispered in bars after too many drinks. He'd been researching the location for months, reading old newspaper clippings and hunting forums, talking to retired loggers who'd worked these mountains decades ago. The stories all had common elements: a massive creature walking upright like a human, but bigger than any human had a right to be, covered in dark fur, incredibly strong, and smart enough to stay hidden from casual observers. The first recorded sighting in this area went back to the 1940s, when a logging crew reported finding footprints the size of dinner plates sunk deep into the mud near their camp. Over the years, there had been dozens more encounters. Hunters who'd had their camps destroyed overnight by something with immense strength. Loggers who'd heard calls in the forest that didn't match any known animal. Hikers who'd caught glimpses of something watching them from deep within the trees. But the stories that really grabbed his attention came from locals who lived on the edge of the forest in tiny communities most people didn't even know existed. These weren't tourists or weekend warriors looking for thrills. These were families who'd been living off the land for generations, people who knew the difference between a bear and something else entirely. They talked about a creature that was sometimes seen at the edge of their properties, standing motionless among the trees and watching their homes. Children were forbidden to play outside after dark. Pets that wandered too far from home sometimes never came back. And every few years, hunters would go into the deep woods and simply disappear, leaving behind camps that looked like they'd been hit by a tornado. The most detailed account came from an old trapper who'd come face to face with the creature back in the 1980s. He'd been checking his trap lines when he'd come across something that had been systematically destroying every trap he found. When he followed the trail of destruction, he found himself in a small clearing where something huge had been living. There were crude shelters made of woven branches, areas where vegetation had been gathered and sorted into piles, and what looked like tools made from stone and wood. But what stuck with him most was the smell. He described it as a mix of wet animal fur and something rotting, so strong it made his eyes water. He'd been examining one of the branch structures when he heard a sound behind him that chilled him to the bone. He turned to see a creature that had to be easily 8 feet tall, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him. He said he'd never forget the eyes. They weren't the eyes of an animal. There was intelligence there, awareness, something that recognized his presence as an intrusion. The creature didn't attack or make any aggressive moves. It just stood there, letting the trapper know this was its territory, and he wasn't welcome. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the creature turned and walked away into the dense forest, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. The trapper gathered his traps and never returned to that area. He started telling people about what he'd seen, but he found that most either didn't believe him or thought he'd had an encounter with a confused bear. The only ones who took his story seriously were other old-timers from the woods who'd had their own experiences. They'd quietly admit they knew something lived in the deep parts of these mountains, something that was best left alone. My friend had collected dozens of these accounts, and they all painted a consistent pattern. These creatures, whatever they were, weren't ordinary animals. They showed signs of intelligence, territorial behavior, and the ability to avoid human detection with remarkable efficiency. Some hunters reported finding elaborate stick structures, interwoven branch formations that were too complex to be natural, but seemed to serve no obvious purpose. Others had found areas where large amounts of food, primarily berries and roots, had been systematically gathered and stored. Loggers who'd worked these mountains had their own stories. They talked about finding young trees twisted into strange patterns, their trunks bent and interwoven in ways that defied natural explanation. They reported feeling watched as they worked, that persistent sense of unseen eyes tracking their every move. Crews would experience inexplicable equipment failures, tools disappearing only to be found miles away, and strange calls echoing through the forest during the early morning hours. What made these stories particularly compelling was how reluctantly they were shared. These weren't attention seekers making up tales for a thrill. These were hard-working men and women who clearly would have preferred to forget their experiences, but felt compelled to warn others about what might be encountered in the depths of the forest. Many spoke of an unwritten understanding among locals. Certain areas were simply avoided, certain trails weren't taken after dark, and if you saw something you couldn't explain, your best bet was to back away slowly and not return. The physical evidence my friend had gathered was equally intriguing. Photos of footprints that were clearly bipedal but much larger than any human print, showing a 5-toed foot and what looked like knuckles on the balls of the feet. Sound recordings of vocalizations that didn't match any known animal in the region. High-pitched screeches, deep rumbling howls, and what some described as imitations of human speech. Trail camera footage showing dark, blurry shapes moving through the frame too quickly for clear identification, but moving in ways that suggested bipedal locomotion. He explained that this expedition wasn't just about proving the existence of these creatures, it was about the hunt. He and the other two had been planning this for over a year, studying sighting patterns, identifying areas with the highest concentration of recent reports, and developing a strategy to track and potentially take a specimen. The way he described it made it sound almost scientific, as if they were conducting field research rather than planning to kill something that might or might not exist. That first night around the fire, they laid out their plan. We'd spend a week in the area, setting up observation posts, deploying trail cameras, and tracking any signs of the creature's activity. If we managed to confirm their presence, we'd move on to active tracking. The stated goal was documentation, clear photographs, hair samples, footprint casts, anything that could provide scientific evidence. But we were carrying enough firepower to take down a grizzly bear, and the way the guys kept checking their rifles suggested documentation might not be their only objective. I should have left then. I should have demanded they take me back to civilization and told them to count on someone else for their Bigfoot hunting delusions. But I didn't. Part of me was excited for the adventure, for the possibility of experiencing something most people only see on sensationalist TV shows. And another part of me, a darker part I don't like to admit, wanted to prove the rumors were real. I wanted to be part of something significant, even if that something meant tracking and potentially harming a creature we were intruding upon in its territory. The next few days established a pattern that started to feel both routine and increasingly unsettling. We'd wake up before dawn, eat a quick breakfast of freeze-dried food and instant coffee, then split up to cover more ground. Two of us would track the surrounding area for signs, while the other two set up and checked our trail cameras. We'd brought a dozen motion-activated cameras, placing them along animal trails, near water sources, and in areas where vegetation showed signs of recent disturbance. On the second day, we started finding things that didn't fit with normal wildlife activity. Young trees that had been bent and interwoven in complex patterns, their branches twisted together in ways that seemed deliberate. Piles of rocks arranged in carefully balanced conical mounds that would topple if any natural movement occurred. Areas where moss and ferns had been ripped from the forest floor in circular patches, exposing the dirt beneath for no apparent reason. The footprints were what really grabbed our attention. We found them along stream beds and in patches of soft mud, deep impressions showing 5 toes with a distinct arch and what looked like pads rather than smooth skin. The measurements suggested something with feet 16 to 18 inches long and 7 to 8 inches wide. The depth of the impressions indicated substantial weight, possibly 500 to 700 pounds, based on the guy's best estimates. Most disturbing was that the trackways showed a gait pattern that was clearly bipedal, but with a stride much longer than any humans. We made plaster casts of the best impressions we found. The process took hours, carefully mixing plaster with creek water, pouring it into the prints and waiting for it to harden enough to transport. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The surrounding forest seemed too quiet, the normal sounds of birds and small mammals noticeably absent. Every now and then, one of us would freeze and point towards the trees. Sure, he'd seen movement, but whatever had been there was gone before the others could confirm it. The trail cameras started producing results by the 3rd day, though nothing conclusive. We had dozens of shots of deer, raccoons, and once a large black bear that ambled right in front of one of our cameras. But we also had strange shots. Pictures taken in the middle of the night, showing what looked like branches moving when there was no wind. Dark shapes at the edge of the frames that could have been shadows or could have been something else, and several instances where the cameras themselves had been moved or reoriented by something strong enough to shift their angle, but careful enough not to trigger video recording. One of the guys, a fellow named Jake who'd been hunting his whole life, started acting antsy. He mentioned finding small piles of twigs, arranged in patterns he recognized from his earlier hunting trips. Warning signs, he called them. Territorial markers left by something that wanted us to know we were being monitored. He suggested we move deeper into the forest, away from our base camp, to avoid whatever was paying attention to our presence. But the group leader, a guy named Derek who'd organized the whole expedition, insisted we stay put. He said the warning signs were exactly what we'd come to find, proof that the creatures were aware of us and potentially closing in to investigate. He upped our nightly watches, having 2 people awake at all times, rifles loaded and powerful flashlights ready to illuminate anything that approached the camp. The 4th day brought our first real encounter, though it was brief and left more questions than answers. I was paired with the 3rd member of our group, a guy named Tom, who'd been unusually quiet for the trip. We were checking a line of trail cameras about 2 miles from base camp when we heard something moving through the forest towards us. It wasn't the sound of an animal trying to be stealthy. It was the sound of something large, moving deliberately, breaking branches and pushing through underbrush with enough force to make the vegetation crack and groan. We froze, rifles at the ready, waiting for whatever was approaching to emerge from the trees. The movement stopped about 50 yards away, hidden behind a dense patch of young firs. For several minutes, nothing happened. We just stood there listening, trying to make out something through the foliage. Then we heard a vocalization that made the hair on my neck stand on end. It started as a low, rumbling growl, almost subsonic, that I could feel in my chest. It gradually rose in pitch and volume, morphing into something between a howl and a scream before cutting off abruptly. It was no sound I'd ever heard from any animal I was familiar with. Tom raised his rifle and yelled towards the trees, identifying us as humans and demanding whatever was there show itself. In response, we heard the sound of something hitting trees, rhythmic thuds that echoed through the forest, followed by another one of those strange screeches. Then whatever had been there simply moved off. We heard it crashing back through the undergrowth, moving away from us at a speed that seemed impossible for something moving through such dense forest. When we examined the area where it had stood, we found broken branches 8 to 9 feet off the ground, tufts of dark, thick hair snagged on tree bark, and several deep footprints in the soft forest floor. The hair was unlike anything we could identify, thick and coarse, dark brown to almost black, too long to be from a bear, but too thick to be from any primate we knew. We carefully bagged it, along with plaster casts of the clearest footprints, and hurried back to camp. Derek was excited when we shared our findings. He said this confirmed everything he'd been researching. We had physical evidence, audio recordings of the vocalizations Tom had managed to capture on his phone, and GPS locations where the encounter had occurred. But when he suggested we go back into the area that night with spotlights and cameras, both Tom and Jake objected. Something about the encounter had shaken them profoundly. The way the creature had deliberately announced itself before approaching, the territorial warning signs we'd been finding, the feeling that we were being evaluated rather than simply observed. It all suggested that whatever lived in these woods was far more intelligent and potentially dangerous than they had anticipated. We spent that night in camp, the fire burning bright, rifles loaded resting beside each of us. The forest around us seemed to have come alive with sounds, twigs snapping in the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. Strange vocalizations echoing from multiple directions, sometimes sounding miles away, other times disturbingly close. At one point around 2 a.m., we heard something large circling our camp, staying just out of visual range, but making enough noise to make it clear it was there. Jake wanted to fire a shot into the air to scare off whatever was lurking, but Derek forbade it. He said shooting would only provoke a response, and we had no idea what kind of response that might be. By the time the sun came up, we were all exhausted and on edge. The fifth day split us as a group. Tom and Jake wanted to pack up and leave immediately. They'd come to hunt, yes, but what we'd found seemed beyond anything they'd anticipated. The creatures weren't just big animals. They were something that displayed complex territorial behavior, possibly lived in social groups, and seemed to be assessing our intentions with unnerving intelligence. Derek, however, insisted we stay. He argued that we were on the verge of something monumental. With just a few more days, we could get clear photographic or video evidence that would revolutionize scientific understanding of North American primates. He even suggested that if we could take a specimen, just one, we could solve the mystery once and for all and potentially make millions from media rights and scientific endorsements. I stayed quiet during the argument, torn between the thrill of what we'd experienced and a growing sense of unease about what we were actually doing here. These woods weren't ours. We were intruders in territory that had clearly been claimed by something that had lived here long before modern humans arrived. The warnings we'd received, both from locals before our trip and from the signs we'd been finding, all suggested that pushing forward was extremely foolish. The compromise we finally reached was to stay 2 more days, but to modify our approach. No more active tracking. Instead, we would set up an observation station with our best camera gear and simply document whatever approached. Derek knew of a ridge about 3 miles from base camp that offered views into a small valley where the trail cameras had captured the most activity. We could set up there, remain silent and still, and wait for the creatures to reveal more about themselves. We spent the rest of that day packing gear and making the trek to the ridge. The trail up was brutal, gaining elevation through terrain that was more climbing than hiking in places. But Derek was right about the site. From our position, we could see a small meadow surrounded by dense forest with a creek snaking through it. Multiple animal trails converged in the area, making it a logical place for wildlife to pass through. We set up our tents behind a line of rocks that offered both cover and a good vantage point. Derek set up his cameras and video equipment, including a high-definition camera with a telephoto lens that could capture clear detail from our elevated location. Tom and Jake established an observation schedule, 2-hour shifts, someone always watching while the others rested. I took the first observation shift that night. The sun set over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple before fading into the deep blue of twilight. As the last vestiges of light disappeared, the valley below began to transform. Deer emerged from the forest to graze in the meadow. A lone elk appeared near the creek, drinking deeply before disappearing back into the trees. Night birds began their calls. Everything seemed peaceful, normal, exactly what you'd expect to see in pristine wilderness. Then, about an hour into my watch, everything changed. The deer that had been grazing peacefully suddenly lifted their heads in unison, ears forward, bodies tense. For a moment they stood frozen like that, then they exploded into motion, fleeing the meadow in all directions. The elk disappeared so quickly I almost missed it. Even the birds went silent. The valley became completely still. I grabbed the night vision binoculars and scanned the tree line where the deer had been looking. At first, I saw nothing. Then I caught movement. Something large separating itself from the shadows under the trees. Even through the night vision technology that made everything look green and grainy, I could see this was no ordinary animal. It walked on two legs with a gait that seemed almost human, but with a fluidity and power no human could match. Its body was covered in what looked like long, dark fur. I estimated its height somewhere between 7.5 and 8 feet based on its size relative to the trees it passed. It moved towards the creek with deliberate confidence, stopping occasionally to examine the ground or reach out to inspect low branches. I woke Derek and the others quietly. They needed to see this. As Derek began filming, the creature knelt by the creek. We watched it drink, lifting water with what were clearly hands rather than paws. Then it sat down on a large rock, adopting a posture that looked remarkably human, and simply looked out over the valley. We were watching for nearly 20 minutes when a second creature emerged from the woods. This one was noticeably smaller, maybe 6.5 feet tall, with a more juvenile-seeming gait. The two creatures approached each other, and we could see interaction that seemed clearly social. The larger creature reached out and touched the smaller one's head in what almost looked like an affectionate gesture. Then both moved to the edge of the meadow where they began to, we assumed, gather food. They were pulling up plants, examining them, and putting them into what looked like crude bags made of woven bark. The evidence of tool use and complex social behavior was overwhelming. Derek was filming everything, whispering excitedly about how groundbreaking this footage would be. Jake and Tom watched in silence, their earlier fear apparently replaced by awe at what we were witnessing. I was torn between fascination and a growing sense that we were violating something profoundly private. These creatures didn't know they were being watched. We were documenting aspects of their lives that they clearly preferred to keep hidden from humans. Then Derek ruined everything. I guess he thought he could get closer undetected. Or maybe the excitement of the catch clouded his judgment. But he suddenly announced he was going to head down into the valley for better shots. Before any of us could stop him, he'd grabbed his camera and started descending the ridge, moving as quietly as possible through the rocky terrain. We watched in horror as he made his way down, stopping behind trees and rocks, getting closer and closer to where the two creatures were continuing to gather plants. He made it to about 100 yards away before they became aware of his presence. The larger creature froze immediately, then turned to look directly towards where Derek was hiding behind a large fir tree. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the creature did something none of us expected. It moved deliberately in front of the smaller creature, adopting what could only be described as a protective stance. Then it emitted a vocalization that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the howl we'd heard before. This was deeper, more controlled, and carried unmistakable communication. It was a warning, clear as day, telling Derek that he had crossed a line. Derek, to his credit, froze too. He held his camera still, making no threatening movements. For several minutes, creature and human simply watched each other. Then the creature did something that still disturbs me to this day. It reached down and picked up a rock, maybe the size of a grapefruit, and threw it, not at Derek but at a tree about 10 feet to his left. The rock hit the tree with enough force to tear the bark, demonstrating both incredible strength and precise control. The message was unmistakable. You could have been the target. Now leave. Derek backed away slowly, keeping his position towards the creatures, moving as carefully as he had descended. The creatures watched him go, the larger one remaining in its protective stance until Derek had made his way back up the ridge to our position. By the time he returned, trembling from adrenaline, both creatures had vanished back into the woods. That night was spent in heated debate. Derek insisted his footage would prove the creature's existence once and for all. But Jake and Tom were furious. Not only had Derek put his own safety at risk, but he had shown the creatures that humans were a threat. The protective way the larger creature had shielded the smaller one, the clear communication in their actions and vocalizations, all suggested these were mothers protecting their young, families trying to survive in their natural habitat. And we had just shown them that humans would harass them even here, in the deepest wilderness. I wanted to leave immediately, pack up our gear and get out before we caused any more harm. But Derek argued that we'd already made the discovery. The creatures knew we were here now anyway. One more night of observation from our safe position on the ridge with no further approaches, and then we'd leave with enough evidence to change science forever. Jake and Tom finally agreed, albeit reluctantly. We established a strict observation schedule, 2 people watching at all times, no moving from our position no matter what. The 6th day dawned cold and foggy. We'd had a quiet night, watching the valley below, but seeing no further signs of the creatures. The forest seemed to have become strangely silent, as if everything was holding its breath. Tom and I took the morning observation shift while Derek and Jake rested. Nothing remarkable happened for hours. The sun burned off the fog. Normal animals, deer and a couple of elk, ventured into the meadow. Birds flew through the valley. I was almost starting to relax when Tom grabbed my arm sharply. He was looking not towards the valley, but behind us, back towards the forest surrounding our ridge. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Along the tree line behind our position, barely visible in the dense foliage, were shapes. Large, dark, furry shapes, at least 5 or 6 of them, spaced in a semicircle that effectively blocked any route of retreat back to base camp. They weren't moving towards us. They were just there, watching. I woke Derek and Jake as quietly as possible. When they saw what we were seeing, the situation suddenly became real in ways no amount of planning or hunter bravado had prepared us for. We weren't hunting anything. We were the ones being surrounded. The creatures had allowed us to see 2 of them in the valley below, distracting our attention while others positioned themselves behind us. Now we were trapped on this ridge with sheer cliffs on 3 sides and unknown creatures blocking the 4th. Derek whispered that we should prepare to defend ourselves if necessary. But Jake shook his head. He pointed out that the creatures weren't advancing. They weren't making threatening vocalizations. They were just there, making a point. They had outmaneuvered us, they had surrounded us, they could attack if they wanted to, but instead they were demonstrating their superiority without violence. We spent hours in that stalemate. The creatures remained in their positions. We didn't dare move. The sun slowly tracked across the sky. Gradually, the terrible realization of what we had actually been doing began to dawn on me. We had come to hunt something that was never just animals. These were people, in some fundamental sense of the word. They had families, territories, complex communication, tool use, and strategic thinking. And we had invaded their home with rifles and cameras, planning to kill them or expose them to the world without a thought for the consequences. As the sun began to set, the creatures finally moved. But not towards us. They simply withdrew back into the forest, disappearing as quietly as they had appeared. They left us unharmed, but with a perfectly clear message: get out. We packed our gear in record time, almost running down the ridge back towards base camp in the approaching darkness. All the way, I could feel eyes watching us, making sure we left. We reached our base camp around midnight, threw everything into unorganized backpacks, and started the hike back towards where we'd left the truck. We walked all night using headlamps, stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste to get away. By the time we reached the truck at dawn on the 7th day, we were exhausted, disheveled, and profoundly shaken by what we had experienced. The drive back to civilization was mostly silent, each of us processing what it meant, what we had seen. Derek still had his footage, hours of recordings of the creatures in the valley, but when he started talking about making it public, Jake and Tom flatly refused. They argued that what we had found deserved protection, not exploitation, that revealing the creatures' locations and behaviors would only put them in danger from more ruthless hunters than us. I spent weeks after our return unable to sleep properly. Nightmares would wake me, images of those creatures surrounding us, but instead of retreating peacefully, they attacked. Or worse, images of what we might have done if things had gone differently. If Derek had decided to shoot instead of retreat, if the creatures had decided to eliminate the threat we represented, instead of just scaring us off. Eventually, Derek gave in to the pressure from the three of us and agreed to never publish the footage. But I know he still has it, tucked away somewhere, tempting him with thoughts of what it could bring. Jake and Tom never went hunting again. They said after looking into the eyes of those creatures, after seeing the clear intelligence and social organization, they could no longer justify killing animals for sport. I never went hunting again either. But more than that, I rarely venture into deep wilderness at all now, because I know what's out there. I know that humans aren't the only intelligent creatures walking these woods, and I know there are things that are better left undiscovered, mysteries that serve a purpose by remaining unsolved. The deep woods of the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest, over 1 million acres of mostly unexplored wilderness, hold secrets that most people will never know. But for those of us who have penetrated deep enough, who have seen what lies beyond the trails and roads, the knowledge comes with a weight. We share an unspoken silence, an agreement to protect what we found by leaving it alone. The creatures we encountered that week still live in those forests. They still build their twig shelters, gather their food, raise their families in relative peace, and they will remain hidden as long as people like us keep their secrets, because some mysteries exist not to be solved, but to remind us that the world is bigger and stranger than our limited knowledge can comprehend. 3 months ago, an experienced hunter named David Reeves vanished in the northern Washington Cascade Mountains. He carried state-of-the-art GPS tracking gear, years of wilderness survival experience, and was systematically tracking reports of unusual wildlife activity in one of the peninsula's most remote areas. Search teams found his campsite intact 6 days after his scheduled check-in. His rifle remained propped against a tree, safety engaged. His communication gear was functional but unused, food and provisions untouched. His tent showed signs of a hasty but non-violent exit, and surrounding the campsite in a perfect semicircle were massive bipedal footprints, each sinking several inches into the forest floor. David had come here deliberately seeking the very kind of encounter his meticulously detailed journals described. He had spent months researching historical sighting patterns, collecting witness accounts from locals, and mapping areas where sightings of unknown creatures overlapped with unusual geographical features. His notes revealed a fascination bordering on obsession, along with a growing confidence that he was on the cusp of a monumental breakthrough in cryptozoology. The first few weeks of his expedition were carefully documented. He set up extensive trail cameras along animal paths and water sources. He catalogued unusual stick structures he found in configurations that defied natural explanation. He recorded vocalizations that didn't match any known species in the region's wildlife database. His photographs showed footprints, unidentified hair snagged on tree bark, and signs of foraging that suggested intelligence beyond instinctive animal behavior. But his final entries notably shifted in tone. They began to describe a growing sense of being watched. References to finding his equipment subtly moved during absences from his camp, mentions of sounds circling his position during night hours. His writing suggested someone who realized too late that the act of tracking might be reciprocal. The last entry in his journal, dated the day before his disappearance, described an encounter that had left him simultaneously thrilled and deeply unsettled. While checking trail cameras in a remote ravine, he had found an area showing unmistakable signs of intelligent habitation. Crude shelters built from woven branches, resting places lined with moss and ferns, stone tools laid out in what appeared to be deliberate configurations, and most disturbingly, evidence that these structures had been used recently, within days or hours of his discovery. He described feeling a presence while examining the site, a sense of unseen observational weight that became so intense he eventually fled the area. But his scientific curiosity apparently outweighed his apprehension because he planned to return the next day with better camera equipment. He never returned from that return trip. Search teams followed his tracks to the ravine he'd described, finding the structures exactly as he had documented them. But the area showed signs of significant activity subsequent to his visit. The shelters had been systematically dismantled, the stone tools removed, the moss and ferns scattered. It was as if whatever had been living there had deliberately packed up and relocated, not wanting to leave evidence that could attract further human attention. Most disturbingly, his GPS tracks ended at the ravine, with no indication of where he had gone afterward. The device simply stopped transmitting his location, as if it had been deliberately turned off or taken into an area where satellite signals could not penetrate. Search teams methodically expanded their grid, covering square miles of difficult terrain. They found more unsettling signs. Massive bipedal footprints that seemed to track along the same routes the search teams were using, as if something was monitoring their efforts from safe distances. Trail cameras placed by searchers captured footage showing large, dark shapes observing search activities from distant tree lines. Several search team members reported experiences that were difficult to officially quantify but impossible to dismiss. Sensations of being watched, strange vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Encounters where something large moved through dense vegetation just beyond visual range, pacing search teams but never fully revealing itself. The tracking dogs brought in to assist with the search exhibited unusual behavior. They would follow normal human scent trails without issue, but when they encountered certain areas, particularly those where the massive footprints were most prevalent, the animals would become agitated and refuse to proceed. Several experienced dogs with years of search and rescue work would simply sit and whine when directed towards specific trails, as if sensing something their human handlers couldn't detect. The official investigation eventually expanded beyond standard search and rescue to include wildlife analysis. Biologists examined hair collected from tree bark near David's camp, finding it didn't match any known species in the region. DNA analysis yielded results that were simultaneously intriguing and baffling, showing genetic markers that suggested primate ancestry but didn't match any catalogued species. Casts taken from the clearest footprints revealed anatomy that was disconcertingly human in basic structure, but dramatically different in scale and proportions. The arch of the foot, the arrangement of the toes, the weight distribution, all suggested bipedal locomotion by a creature weighing significantly more than average humans. Forensic experts examining the casts noted details that would be almost impossible to fake. dermatoglyphs, lines equivalent to fingerprints, on the footpads, signs of a prehensile foot showing gripping ability, wear marks consistent with walking barefoot over varied terrain for extended periods. As weeks passed with no sign of David, the investigation began to focus less on active searching and more on understanding what might have happened. Search teams interviewed every person who had reported unusual encounters in the Cascade Mountains over the past decades. Patterns emerged from these testimonies that painted a disturbing picture of a hidden ecosystem operating alongside known wildlife populations. Locals described specific areas they instinctively avoided, trails where the silence became too profound, where birds and small mammals seemed to vanish completely. Ridges where strange encounters occurred with enough regularity that experienced hunters had simply learned not to venture further. Indigenous communities, when approached carefully and respectfully, acknowledged awareness of the forest beings, but were reluctant to discuss details with outside investigators. Their oral tradition spoke of protocols for safe interaction with the forest people, but these protocols were considered sacred knowledge, not to be shared with those lacking the appropriate cultural context and preparation. The investigation also uncovered evidence of possible governmental awareness of the creatures dating back several decades. Heavily redacted documents obtained through persistent research showed that several federal agencies had investigated unusual wildlife reports in the Cascades, but the details of their findings remained classified. The pattern of official silence suggested that knowledge of the creatures existed at higher levels of government, but was being actively suppressed to prevent public panic or ecological disruption. A private investigator hired by David's family discovered a particularly unsettling connection. Each of the disappearances had occurred after individuals had reported plans to track or document unusual wildlife activity. These were not casual adventurers who stumbled into dangerous situations. These were individuals actively seeking encounters, equipped with cameras and recording gear, determined to prove the existence of something that preferred to remain unproven. The final days of the official search brought a discovery that encapsulated the entire strangeness of the case. Equipment working near the ravine, where David had documented the shelters, found his camera hanging from a tree branch approximately 12 feet off the ground. It hadn't been thrown there or placed randomly. It had been carefully tied with vine, positioned to point back towards the trail David would have taken approaching the area. The memory card contained hundreds of photos, many of them taken after the last timestamp in his journal. The images showed a disturbing progression. Early photos captured the structures and signs David had described. Later shots showed areas of the forest that had obviously been deliberately cleared of evidence. Branches carefully arranged to conceal trails, stone tools removed. Then the photos completely shifted perspective. Instead of shots David would have taken, the images showed views from angles and heights impossible for a human photographer. Shots looking down from treetops, images captured from positions that would have required being 10 to 12 feet off the ground. And finally, a series of photos that appeared to show David's campsite equipment being systematically examined by hands that were clearly visible in the frames, large and covered in dark hair, manipulating his possessions with what could only be described as curiosity. The camera had been operated by whatever David had come here looking for, and whatever it was, had documented its own examination of his equipment, then hung the camera where it would eventually be found, as if it knew search teams would come and wanted to provide evidence of something, but not in a way that could be traced back to its current locations. The official search for David Reeves was suspended after 6 weeks. He was listed as missing under unknown circumstances. His family continues to seek answers, hiring private trackers and wildlife specialists to continue the investigation. But each new search attempt ends the same way. signs that something intelligent continues to inhabit these mountains, but no sign of David himself. The photographic evidence from his camera remains among the most perplexing documents ever recovered from a missing person case. It clearly shows entities manipulating human technology with curiosity and purpose. But as with so many other similar cases, the scientific community remains divided between those who see compelling evidence of unknown primate species and those who dismiss it all as elaborate hoax or misinterpretation of natural evidence. For the people who knew David, for the people who live on the edge of these forests, for the few researchers willing to consider explanations beyond catalogued wildlife, the implications are clear. Vast areas of North American wilderness harbor populations of creatures that have successfully avoided scientific detection through a combination of intelligence, territorial behavior, and the sheer immensity of their habitat. These creatures appear to possess a sophistication that matches or exceeds humans in some domains. They understand technology enough to examine and operate camera equipment. They demonstrate strategic planning in how they manage their territories and interactions with humans. They exhibit what can only be described as curiosity about human intruders, to the point of documenting encounters from their own perspectives. The case of David Reeves serves as a warning about the risks of seeking encounters with unknown phenomena. The deep forest operates under different rules than civilized human environments. What appears to be ordinary wildlife may be a complex ecosystem inhabited by intelligences that prefer to remain hidden. And those who push too deeply into protected territories may find themselves facing consequences that no amount of preparation or experience can mitigate. The search for David revealed more than just the details of his disappearance. It revealed patterns of encounters stretching back decades, suggestions of a sustainable population of unknown creatures living practically under human noses. The Cascade Mountains, with their millions of acres of mostly inaccessible forest, provide perfect habitat for species that need distance from human settlement. The story continues to unfold. More hunters report strange encounters. More trail cameras capture ambiguous footage. More people disappear under circumstances that defy easy explanation. And at the center of it all remains the question David had dedicated months of his life to answering: what truly inhabits the deepest woods of North America? The evidence suggests the answer is both more complex and more disturbing than most people are willing to consider. Every site showed similar characteristics: systematic destruction of equipment, personal items arranged in unnatural patterns, and the same massive footprints leading away into the deeper parts of the forest. The tracking dogs brought in to follow David's trail exhibited behavior their handlers had never encountered in decades of search and rescue work. The animals would follow normal human scent trails up to the edge of David's campsite, then refuse to go any further. Several dogs showed signs of extreme agitation when directed towards the trails leading away from the camp, whining and recoiling as if sensing some predatory presence their human handlers couldn't detect. Most experienced trackers eventually refused to follow the creature's trails beyond a certain point. The massive footprints led through terrain that became increasingly impossible for humans to navigate, across sheer rock faces that would require climbing gear, through thorn bushes so dense that passage would shred clothing and skin, and into cave systems that extended deep underground with no obvious exits. Search teams equipped with rappelling gear attempted to follow some of the subterranean passages, but found the cave systems extended far beyond what their equipment could safely reach. Emergency radios failed to maintain contact once teams moved more than a few hundred feet into the tunnels, and several searchers reported an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen observers in the darkness. The investigation took on an increasingly surreal quality as evidence mounted that seemed to defy rational explanation. Trail cameras placed throughout the search area captured footage of the creatures on dozens of occasions, But the beings seemed aware of the camera placements and often approached to examine the devices before continuing on their way. In several instances, cameras were found repositioned to face different directions, as if the creatures were deliberately redirecting the surveillance equipment. Ground teams reported finding identical tree structures to those David had documented, but discovered these constructions would appear and disappear with disturbing frequency. Shelters that had been photographed and GPS marked would vanish when teams returned the next day, while new constructions would appear in different locations overnight. The implications were profoundly unsettling. Either the creatures were actively managing their territorial markers in response to human search activities, or they possessed the ability to construct and deconstruct massive wooden frames with impossible speed. Evidence of the creatures' intelligence became increasingly apparent as the search progressed. Search teams began finding their own equipment moved or examined during overnight camps. Nothing was ever taken or damaged, but personal items would be found carefully arranged in patterns that suggested they had been studied by entities trying to understand human technology and behavior. More disturbing were the signs that the creatures were actively monitoring and perhaps influencing search efforts. Teams would arrive at predetermined search coordinates only to find that obvious clues had been removed or obscured, while new evidence would appear in areas that had been exhaustively searched the day before. The pattern suggested that the beings responsible for David's disappearance were aware of human search protocols and were systematically staying one step ahead of the investigation. Several search team members reported encounters that they were initially reluctant to officially describe. These sightings involved glimpses of massive, fur-covered figures observing search activities from distant ridgelines or tree lines. The creatures never approached close enough for detailed observation, but their presence was unmistakable to anyone who caught sight of them. What made these encounters most unsettling was the clear intelligence behind the creatures' behavior. They positioned themselves where they could observe human activities while remaining at safe distances, displaying tactical awareness that suggested a sophisticated understanding of human capabilities and limitations. The official search was suspended after 6 months when it became clear that conventional search and rescue techniques were inadequate for the terrain and circumstances involved. The final report listed David Reeves as missing under unknown circumstances, though investigating officers privately acknowledged that the evidence pointed towards some form of animal involvement. Animal involvement of a type that had no precedent in official wildlife documentation. Unofficially, the search efforts revealed evidence of a hidden ecosystem operating parallel to the known wildlife populations of the Cascade Mountains. The massive footprints found throughout the search area suggested a breeding population of unknown primates that had somehow remained undetected by conventional biology. The sophistication of their tool use and construction techniques indicated levels of intelligence that defied assumptions about human uniqueness in the natural world. More problematically was the accumulated evidence that these creatures had been interacting with humans for far longer than anyone had realized. Research into historical missing person cases in the region revealed patterns stretching back over a century. Experienced woodsmen, hunters and hikers who had vanished without a trace in areas where creature sign was most concentrated. Indigenous communities, when approached carefully and respectfully, acknowledged awareness of the forest beings, but were reluctant to discuss details with outside investigators. Their oral tradition spoke of protocols for safe interaction with the forest people, but these protocols were considered sacred knowledge, not to be shared with those lacking the appropriate cultural context and preparation. The investigation also revealed evidence of possible governmental awareness of the creatures dating back several decades. Heavily redacted documents obtained through persistent research showed that several federal agencies had investigated unusual wildlife reports in the Cascades, but the details of their findings remained classified. The pattern of official silence suggested that knowledge of the creatures existed at higher levels of government, but was being actively suppressed to prevent public panic or ecological disruption. A private investigator hired by David's family continued to search long after official efforts concluded, but found himself dealing with the same impossible circumstances that had hampered the initial search teams. The creatures appeared capable of existing within the forest ecosystem without leaving the kind of consistent sign that would allow for systematic tracking. They seemed to possess not only physical capabilities that far exceeded human norms, but also sufficient intelligence to understand and counter human search methodologies. The investigation ultimately raised more questions than it answered about what inhabited the deepest parts of the Cascade Mountains wilderness. David Reeves had ventured into a region where different rules applied, where intelligence existed in forms that conventional science refused to acknowledge, and where the line between the natural and the supernatural became increasingly blurred. His disappearance served as a reminder that vast areas of the North American wilderness remained essentially unexplored, not due to geographical inaccessibility, but because they were actively defended by intelligences that predated human presence on the continent. The forest had claimed another victim, but David's documentation ensured that his fate would not be forgotten and that others would be warned of the risks of venturing too deep into places where humanity was neither welcome nor dominant. For more interesting stories, check this out.